being a cultural responders. And the reality is the church has often acted as cultural responders rather than cultural engagers. We respond to culture rather than engage with it. What I mean by that is responding is reactive, right? It's unintentional. When something happens in front of me, like when I'm driving the car, a deer jumps out in front of me, my reaction is to swerve out of the way of it. There's not a whole lot of intention behind that. It's my just knee-jerk reaction. And I think the church has kind of reacted to culture in a similar way, where something happens and we either swerve or we plow right through it. Like we're not intentional in how we form it. We're just kind of, an event happens and, Pastor John talked about this a few weeks ago in one of his sermons, but people just want to know what's our take, what's our stance, what's our opinion. And I think for seasons that has been what the church has provided, opinions, stances, which are fine, but aren't the whole, end goal. I think as responders to culture, the two main responses that that I see the church taking towards culture are critique and consuming. So I think the two main ways that we act as cultural responders rather than cultural engagers is we critique culture and we consume it. And again, there's plenty more. This is not an end-all, be-all way of engaging this, but critique and consume. I think we've all probably wrestled with those at different times. And so I want to talk through what it looks like for the church to critique and what it looks like for the church to consume and the problems those two things create. So critique, condemnation and the refusal to participate in some cultural aspects. I think we all have that family member or friend who really all they talk about is what's wrong with the world, the conspiracies that are happening. I see smiles because we probably have interacted with those family members this summer on vacation or on holidays, and it's like, man, what do you do anything else other than just like stand there and just criticize everything around you? Like, do you have anything better to do with your time? And unfortunately, there's been seasons of the church where they've been known more for what they're against than what they're for. They're known more for what not to do than what they actually believe someone should do. And they just, I think of like the cheesy example is 1950s America, where it's like the church was like, it was, evil to go to movies. There's a time in like the fundamental Baptist community where it was like, hey, if you go to movies are the devil. And we've swung a long way from that in the church, but it's like a funny moment where it's like, no, we're not going to. Movies are the problem, so we're just never going to participate in movies. It's like, okay, it's an interesting way of going about it. But we see that critique is not motivated by love. Critique is motivated by anger, by frustration. It's not motivated by trying to make something better. It's motivated by pointing a finger and telling that thing to fix itself, which as the church is not an effective way to go about things. And so we need to actually wrestle with, hey, how do I look at the world, and does it bring me frustration or does it break my heart? Does it bring me anger, not out of like, man, like the injustice that's happening, or anger out of that's motivated by love, or anger out of like, I'm so tired of this thing going this way. Like, I can't believe they're doing that. And so I'm just gonna like write it off altogether. And we can easily get there. And if we do, we've handed over our authority as a church to actually be able to speak into moments, to actually care, to actually make change. We've just become that church that has loud opinions and people know what we believe, but we're not actually doing anything to affect change. So that's critique. The much more personal one to me, and I think probably is the one that most people, I think in our day and age struggle with, is this idea of consuming culture. So I talked about movies, 20, 30, 40, however long it actually is, it was common in the church for it to be evil to see movies. Like, it was well known, like, hey, you don't go do that. And I joke around now that I know more people who are Christians that have seen The Hangover than people who have not seen The Hangover. And just in a few generations, we've gone from, hey, never watch movies to like, man, The Hangover is super funny. Right? And some of you have left because some of you in this room, people have seen it. And in one season, we've gone from, hey, let's never do any of that to, let's just engage with all of it. Like, whatever. And so consuming, it's unintentional overindulgence of cultural products. Unintentional overindulgence of cultural products. So I think the way consuming is reactionary is that culture creates something, whether it's a product, a movie, something to be engaged with, and rather than being cautious in how we engage with it, We kind of follow the tide of culture and we just dive right in with everybody else. I actually think of, not that I think this community is the community to follow and everything, but the Amish community, the reason why they are unique in the way they are is because when something is released into culture, they take a season to be like, hey, let's see how it actually goes about, like if it makes things better, if it actually makes the world better, and we'll wait and we'll see, and then we will make decision on behalf of the community if we should engage with it. So that's why I think at a time, I don't know if this is correct now, but for a time they didn't have cars in the Amish community because cars drove people further apart rather than actually connecting them. And so they thought we're going to be a more interconnected community if we don't travel by car. And so it was like a season the Amish didn't travel by car. But that's an example of not being reactionary to something that culture creates and then consuming it. And I think for us, we need to wrestle with the idea of consumer Christianity and how while critiquing drives the people away from the church, consumer Christianity just blends the church and the world together to make it difficult to parse which one is which, to actually begin to pull apart which one is really, like which part of you is actually following Jesus and which part of you is just like everyone else in the world. And it's easy for us to fall into seasons where we actually just look like everyone else. The biggest example I can think of this is I was at a Liberty basketball game 3 years ago, and I was with two of my best friends and my dad. And Liberty was winning the game by a lot, and so I kind of stopped, like in this moment, kind of stopped paying attention. Me and my friends had kind of all like turned to look at something on our phones, and out of nowhere, the student section erupts. And it's at the point in the game where it's like I think a guy's shooting free throws. Like there's no reason why the student section should be erupting. Like it didn't make any sense. So we both turned to each other like, hey, why are they, like, what's going on? Like, why are they erupting? And this is a true story, and it was super uncomfortable. The 16-year-old girl in front of us turned around and said, well, the team has reached a certain score that represents a certain innuendo, and the fans were cheering for it. Now, if you don't know what that number is, you can ask someone later and they can probably explain it to you. But in that moment, we were like, oh man, like she just, it was like so uncomfortable. My dad was right there. We were like, this is the most uncomfortable moment ever, that the 16-year-old girl just had to explain this happened. But like I left that moment being like, at the world's most Christian university, what was being celebrated was a number that's been taken by culture to mean something, a certain innuendo, and that's what's being celebrated at this this Christian school's basketball game. And it was just an example to me of like, wow, all right, cultural consuming that has blurred the lines of what is actually good for us, like holy for us to do. It's actually distinction for us and just what would happen at probably any other university, right? And it was this moment of like, are we actually any different? And that's where cultural consuming has the problem, is it makes us think, are we actually any different? So if we critique the church, again, we're just pushing everyone, we're extending the distance even further. But if we just consume culture, if we critique the culture, not the church, if we just consume culture, then again, we blur the lines of our differences. And again, our salt becomes less salty. We lose the life that we can provide, the life that we know that is abundant, we begin to lose that. And so I want to begin to talk about what does it look like for us to move from just responding, from critiquing and consuming, to engaging.